and thank you very much for tuning in on this quite pleasant afternoon. And it may be because you're mainly very concerned about climate change that you're foregoing sitting outside or having a nice peaceful time in a garden to sit indoors. So that was the question, and that is what the general public says. So you are more concerned than the British public. So to some extent, I'm preaching to the converted here, but on the other hand, I'm delighted really, because if you're very concerned, I guess you're more likely to be interested in what I've got to say. But it is interesting here, isn't it, that there's very, very few people nationally that are not at all concerned. And these results come out every 3 months, and the number that are concerned has steadily risen over the years. So things are moving. I'm just going to quickly go through the evidence. I don't want to labour this too much, but you know, if you're in any doubt as to what the evidence is, this might just reinforce it. So climate change is really all about the greenhouse effect, which has been known about for over 100 years, and it's essentially an effect due to greenhouse gases produced mainly from the surface of the earth, and mainly by burning fossil fuels to produce carbon dioxide. But also there are other greenhouse gases, principally methane, nitrous oxide and water vapor. So they form a blanket stopping the heat being radiated right back out towards space. So it's a slightly thicker and thicker blanket every year that's warming us up. And the carbon dioxide, as I say, is the main greenhouse gas, and this is what's happened to it over the last 800,000 years. You can see that for the vast majority of that time, it's bubbled around, depending on various ice ages, etc., between 200 and 250 parts per million, maybe going up to 300. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was a 300, and then it's rocketed up since then. So the carbon dioxide level in our atmosphere is now well over 400 parts per million. And you can see there down the bottom, human beings evolved about 200 to 300,000 years ago. And so for most of the time as a species we existed, the carbon dioxide has been at that lower level, and that's what we've evolved with. So the greenhouse gas effect has caused the atmosphere to warm. So this is the actual global temperature over the last 100 odd years, and you can see that it's been steadily rising. These are the actual observations. The dark line and the pale line lower down is what is predicted, what would have happened by purely natural drivers without the generation of greenhouse gases by humans. So it's now over 1 degree centigrade warmer than it would have been. So that doesn't sound much, does it? But it is. I don't want to dwell on this. Where do these greenhouse gases come from? Well, this is one way of subdividing it. Fossil fuels used for electricity and heat production, in industry, for vehicles, transport, and in agriculture. There's fossil fuels used, but some of that is methane from livestock, ruminant livestock, and nitrous oxide from the soil. So where do these emissions mainly come from? Which countries? Well, maybe you won't be surprised to know that China produces more carbon dioxide than any other country, because it's the workshop of the world and it's got a lot of people. The USA, as you can see, is pretty high. Russia, major fossil fuel producer, and of course fairly high in Western Europe and Australia, Brazil. So those are countries that emit most. But if you express that on a per person basis, you get a different picture. So China doesn't look quite so dark red now, whereas USA, Canada, Australia, and the Gulf states, Arabian Peninsula, are very high. Per person, those countries are emitting about 15 tons, in some cases in the Gulf states over 20 tons of carbon dioxide per person. In most of Europe, it's around 7 to 10 tons per person. In these countries in Africa, it's about half a ton or even a quarter of a ton per person. Now, I find when I talk to people about what's causing climate change, people often say, yeah, well, there are too many people in the world, aren't there? That's the trouble. And of course, there are a lot of people in the world. And indeed, if there were a lot less people, there'd be a lot less fossil fuels burnt and a lot less greenhouse gases. What you're going to do about that, of course, is pretty tricky, isn't it? Unless we have a whole series of pandemics, the number of people is not likely to go down. Well, wars, of course. I just want to show you, though, how the population is increasing. So this is the number of children per woman. As you can see, over a lot of the world, it's coloured blue, and that's the category of 1 to 2 children per woman. So actually, in quite a lot of countries, the birth rate is low. In fact, the population of some countries is actually going down. But you can see, of course, the red and orange in sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got 4 to 6 children very often per woman. Of course, there's a fair bit of infant mortality, but that's quite a lot. But if you compare that with the last picture, those people hardly generate any greenhouse gases. And their generation per person isn't going up much either. So the population of the world is increasing, mainly in the African countries, but it wouldn't make, it's not making that much difference to total greenhouse gas generation. Okay, what are the impacts? Well, we expect, based on current policies, that by the year 2100, so 8 years from now, temperature will have increased 2.9 degrees. That's the prediction. Who assesses what's happening then? This is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, formed 30 odd years ago. There's 195 member countries, that's most of the countries on Earth, and thousands of scientists contributing to it. So they have to agree on the data and the predictions. So it's a very, very large number of scientists contributing to that. And the IPCC have identified reasons for concern about climate change. I've just picked out a few here. Extreme weather. So it isn't just warming, it's more extreme weather. More droughts, more intense rainfall events, and hence more flooding of rivers, fluvial flooding, disruption of wildlife and ecosystems. Crop yields could be affected, loss of coral reefs, melting ice caps, sea level rise, and coastal flooding. And all of that, the IPCC have pointed out, could lead to mass migration and climate refugees, people no longer able to live in the place that they currently do. So pretty big reasons for concern. Now, I just want to point out that IPCC do make these projections. They're based on big computer models, and they attach levels of confidence to their projections or predictions of what may happen in the future. And they use these words, very high confidence down to very low confidence. So you can see here, if they say there's, say, high confidence that something will happen, well, that means there's an 8 out of 10 chance. Low confidence is only about a 2 out of 10. So there's too much on here. It was the best graphic I could find. So I just want to focus on this bit to start with. So this is the IPCC's way of assessing the impacts, the level of impact and the risks that it poses. And basically, the darker and the more purple the colour, the higher and more serious is the impact. And it's expressed here on these sort of bar charts. You may or may not be able to read this, but this line here, this grey, thick grey line, that's the 1 degree line. That's where we are at the moment. We're 1 degree above base level global temperature. So you can see that already, even where we are at the moment, there are yellow colours, and in some cases darker than yellow. And this scale goes up to 1.5 degrees, which is this level, and 2 degrees, and then the top of these bars is not marked, but it's at least 2.5 degrees. And remember, global temperature, if current trends continue with current projections, is going to reach the top of these bars. So I just want to bring to your attention some of the big and quite short-term effects. Look at warm water corals here. They're already a very high risk of them being damaged, and at 2.9 degrees, I think it's virtually certain that all coral reefs would die. So that would not be a good legacy to leave, would it? The only other one I want to just point out here is coastal flooding, which of course is a very serious matter. And you can see already we're at an orange state here, and at 2.9 degrees, it's in the purple zone, very high impact. And if we look at the 1.5 degrees line, which I shall come on to, that is the current best case scenario that the world is aiming for. We've still got quite a high risk of coastal flooding. So I won't dwell on this any longer. We could return to it if you want to. On the question of coastal flooding then, as you're probably well aware, there's a lot of cities on the coast. We're talking hundreds of millions of people are potentially at risk by the 2050s of coastal flooding. In a report that the IPCC did 3 years ago, where they were asked to look at what would be the effect of global warming of 1.5 degrees, what they said was they've got high confidence of sea level rising, and indeed continuing to rise even if we limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we're still going to get sea level rising, probably for the next 100 years or more. They also said about the big ice sheets in Antarctica and the Greenland ice sheet, that they could become unstable. And those instabilities could be triggered at around 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming. I've got medium confidence in that. So that's what, 5 out of 10 chance. That's a pretty high risk of triggering multi-meter rise in sea level over, could take quite a while, but over the next hundreds to thousands of years. And that could be almost irreversible in, in human lifetime scale. So, pretty serious stuff. So what's being done about it? There is, of course, a large international treaty called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And just about every country is signed up to that treaty. And every few years, in fact, every year, there is some kind of conference of the parties, or COP. That's the decision-making body of the convention. And there's a particularly big conferences about every 5 years. And COP25, which was very significant, was held in Paris in December 2015. And it should have taken place last year, but it had to be postponed because of COVID. So COP26 is going to happen in only 5 months' time in Glasgow. So the UK is privileged to host this big conference. In fact, this is probably the biggest and most important conference on any subject that's ever been held in this country. COP26 starts on the 1st of November. So in Paris last time, there was an agreement, and it was seen as a big success, Paris, because previous COPs had, some of them have been a bit of a failure, really, especially the one in Copenhagen before Paris. Every country agreed to keep global temperature rise well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to keep to 1.5 degrees. And that's known as the Paris Agreement. And it was done on a voluntary basis that each country would decide how much they were going to contribute. So they each contributed what's called a nationally determined contribution, or NDC, and they signed up to review and submit new nationally determined contributions, and they would be more ambitious each time, every time there was a major COP. So that was what was agreed in Paris, the Paris Agreement. Is it on track? There is an organisation called Climate Action Tracker. It's an independent scientific analysis. It's a collaboration between 2 institutes. They don't track every single country in the world, but they include all the biggest emitters and some of the representative sample of the smaller ones, and it covers about 80% of global emissions. So Climate Action Tracker works out, if countries do what they say they're going to do, what will happen to global temperature. A year ago, so that's nearly 5 years after the Paris Agreement, no government was proposing to do anywhere near enough. There's few countries here marked in dark blue. You can see Norway, Chile. If you look very carefully, you might see Jamaica, Andorra and Rwanda there. So not big countries. They had submitted new NDC targets, and a few countries had proposed some but not submitted them, but the vast majority of countries said they either wouldn't update them or they simply hadn't done so yet. So not a good position last year. This is the latest map that we have. Sorry, the legend isn't on there. Legend is on the next slide. But I just want to show you the countries in green, dark green, have submitted more ambitious proposals. The countries in red have not. So, who's submitted more ambitious or stronger proposals? Well, it's Europe, including the UK and the USA mainly. Who's submitted and decided not to increase their ambition? Well, Russia, Brazil and Australia. And down the bottom there, you'll see that one country said it will not propose more ambitious targets. That's Indonesia. In the lighter green here, next to the bottom, you'll see that the biggest emitter, China, and also Japan, which is a pretty big emitter, have proposed stronger targets, but they haven't actually submitted them yet. So things have got better. Countries are proposing things. Not enough countries, of course, are proposing enough yet, but there's still a few months to go till Glasgow. But what would happen, taking the current situation then, what would happen to warming if countries delivered on all those pledges? Well, what we've got on this graph is greenhouse gas emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions. And the black line on the left is how those greenhouse gas emissions have kept going up and up from 1990 right up to 2020. In order to meet the Paris Agreement, pursuing 1.5 degrees, that's what would have to happen. Now, there would have to be a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if we are to meet this trajectory down to net zero to achieve a 1.5 degrees limit to global temperature rise. But that second red oval there, that shows what is currently pledged. And what is currently pledged would result in a 2.4 degrees temperature rise. So not good at all. So we need many more pledges, much more ambitious pledges. Now, turning to this country, what is happening? And our government did pass what was genuinely a world-leading piece of legislation in 2008, the Climate Change Act, which makes it the duty of the Secretary of State, the government, to ensure that all our greenhouse gases, our UK carbon account to the year 2050 it started out lower than 100%. That was revised subsequently to 2008, and it now says at least 100% lower. In other words, what's known as net zero. So the Climate Change Act requires the government to go for this country to be net zero by 2050 in carbon emissions. And that is overseen by the Committee on Climate Change. Sorry, that writing is not very bright, is it? The Committee on Climate Change is an independent statutory committee which advises the UK government, and it produces carbon budgets every few years, which the government has to adhere to. The chair of that committee is Lord Deben, the former John Selwyn Gummer, who's a Conservative peer. What's our record so far? Well, ministers like to say that we're leading the world. Our emissions are down 44% overall. with the baseline 1990. So if you look on government press releases like the one on 20th of April this year, that's what it will say. I have to warn you though that is slightly misleading, because if imports and the embedded greenhouse gas emissions in those imports is included, plus our share of international aviation and shipping, emissions are only down 19%. And over, what is that, 29 years, that's not very much. So our emissions are going down, but nowhere near as much as they need to, and certainly nowhere near as much as you might often hear cited. The Climate Change Committee has to make progress reports to Parliament every so often, and they did one 2 years ago, and they found only 7 of the government's 24 targets were on track. And they said, it's quite a hard-hitting report, it said new and strengthened policies were urgently needed in all sectors. And Lord Deben, Conservative peer, remember, what did he think of progress? Well, that's what he thought, which was quite an amusing quote, but pretty damning. Knowing that that progress report was not likely to be very favourable, the government made a preemptive move, and it did actually announce at that time, remember I said the Climate Change Act was modified, that's when they modified it, a couple of weeks before the progress report came out. So they committed to net zero, which of course was a great thing, and that's what the Climate Change Committee would have wanted. So the Climate Change Committee have now produced a further report last December. Obviously these reports are enormous and they contain a lot of recommendations. These are the main ones. I don't want to go through all this, so let's just highlight a few things which might be relevant to you. They recommend that the government should aim to be reducing travel demand, travel of all kinds, apart from walking and cycling, I would say. Buildings. They say that all buildings should be energy efficient and low carbon, not just new build ones, all existing buildings ought to be energy efficient and low carbon. And the standards for those ought to be enforced. Implication, of course, that they're not very well enforced at the moment. And the skills for making buildings energy efficient need to be developed. Lower down, we've got agriculture and the land and food, cut food waste and encourage a reduction in meat and dairy consumption. I'm sure that will interest you. And aviation and shipping, less surprising, limit aviation growth, which you might say is maybe not as ambitious as you might think, just to limit growth. In other words, it'll keep on growing. They might have said limit aviation. But there we are. That was what the Climate Change Committee suggested. They also, I just want to point out to you that they made some broader comments on methodology and how things are accounted. So they said that we should include aviation and shipping. Remember, I said that from the headline figures that the government likes to quote, aviation and shipping are excluded. Well, Climate Change Committee says they ought to be included, and that is the correct basis for our UK net zero target. But of course, that territorial emissions do not include imports. The greenhouse gas emissions embedded in imports. Well, how important is that? Well, they've said we should reduce our consumption emissions. So that's all our emissions, including those embedded. And if you include them, you increase our territorial emissions by 50%. So it's half as big again. So it's a big deal, imports. Over the last few decades, of course, our manufacturing industries have declined, and we've imported more and more products from overseas, many of them, of course, from China. So we've essentially exported our emissions. The way that it's accounted at the moment, China is the one responsible for the emissions of all the things they produce, which they then sell to us. Well, of course, really, that's down to our demand, isn't it? So why not commit to net zero, including all of our consumption? And this is the rationale that the Climate Change Committee gives. Well, if our territorial emissions are reduced to net zero, and our trading partners reduce their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, well then, our UK consumption emissions would be around 90% below 1990 levels in 2050. In other words, we're proposing to rely on other countries to almost completely decarbonise rather than us reducing our own consumption of imports. Now, we may want to think about that. Okay, what changes do we need to make then? Now, Climate Change Committee has worked out that there are 3 types of changes that need to be made in order to achieve what they call their balanced net zero pathway. In other words, on a graph, the way that we get down to net zero. The black section of this pie are low carbon technologies or fuels. They're things that happen really without you and me having very much to do with it. In other words, it's the decarbonisation mainly of our energy supplies, getting rid of fossil fuel in generating electricity, stopping burning gas and oil, and using renewable energy instead. So that's 41% of what's needed. Now the yellow segment is behavioural change, largely societal or behaviour change. So that's things like, are we going to choose to reduce our meat and dairy consumption? In other words, foods that have got a very high carbon footprint. And are we going to choose products, other products that have got that are produced in a low carbon way? So those are things which we're largely or almost wholly down to us to choose. All the rest, so the brown bit, the 43%, is a mixture. So it's a mixture of technologies and our choices. So you can see in total that we've got 59% of what needs to be done is either partly or wholly down to us, the citizens, the consumers. I don't want to laboriously go through all this, but this is what the climate change suggests. Some of the things that citizens can do. Walk, cycle, rather than drive a car, or take public transport, or consider joining a car club, so you reduce the total number of cars, minimise flying, improve the energy efficiency of your houses with insulation, set your thermostats lower, eat a healthy diet, for example, with less beef, lamb and dairy, because of course reducing meat and dairy consumption generally for most people will tend to be healthier if it's replaced with fruit and vegetables. Eliminate food waste. When you buy things, choose quality products that are going to last rather than single-use or short-use products, and share them if you can. And down the bottom, talk about your experiences, discuss them, help to raise awareness of the need to act. And people with any money ought to consider the impact of what that money is being used for through your pension or your ISA or the companies that you buy from. So investing in low carbon, sustainable companies or products. So those are some of the things we can do. So what are we doing in Climate Action Ilkley? We've only been going for 3 years. We've got 90 members. We've got 450 on our mailing list. We've held a number of public talks when we were allowed to have face-to-face meetings, and a lot of people have come to them. We're pleased with that. Since we've been in lockdown, we've had Zoom talks and discussions. We've worked with the town council. We've helped them with the neighbourhood plan, and they asked us to coordinate the production of a sustainability plan, which the town council has endorsed and a number of other community groups have endorsed. And we've got 3 main action groups within Climate Action Ilkley. There's an energy group, which is all about electricity, gas, solar panels, renewable energy, house insulation project. We've got a transport group. We had a car-free day in 2019. We're going to have another one this autumn, September the 19th. We initiated Enterprise Cars to set up a car club. We've had a consultation on safer streets. We've promoted walking and cycling. We've now bought, with the aid of a lottery grant, 2 electric cargo bikes, which are available for people and businesses to use. And in the Land and Nature group and food group, we've got a community orchard now. We've set up tree trails to raise awareness of the importance of trees. We've had a campaign for gardeners to buy peat-free compost, and we've had a food awareness campaign. And we're bidding for money to expand those and other projects. So we're doing quite a lot. So this is my last slide. What have I said? Key points. The land is warming, the oceans are warming, the weather is getting more extreme and unstable. The wealthy countries, of which we are one, with the highest historic emissions, have been far too slow to respond to climate change. That means we've got to now act quickly, and we've got to act radically. So in Glasgow in November, all countries must be persuaded, and it's up to the UK as the chair to do a lot of that persuading, but they must also be supported. The poorer countries have to be supported to commit to much more ambitious action. We're a world leader, and we have to set the best possible example. So we ought to be following up our pledges with actual action, demonstrable to the rest of the world. And we, of course, as citizens of the UK, can play our part by our personal individual actions, by our actions as a community, and indeed by influencing our representatives, our local and national politicians. That's what we can do, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve, for a highly informative talk. There are no questions as yet in the chat. I don't know if anybody has thought of any questions. If so, would you indicate if you have and unmute yourself. No?
I can see Graham there.
Right, Graham. Have you?
Yes, I think we should be doing everything we can to lean upon and pressurise our members of parliament. We have a populist government that likes to be liked. If we could all say write to the Prime Minister and point out that it was outrageous of him to fly down to St Ives. Her Majesty Queen went down by rail sustainably. This is the sort of thing which might actually have some effect. Also, locally, we should all be protesting against the extension and development of Leeds Bradford Airport, which is totally unnecessary and will cause significant environmental damage.
Yeah, I agree.
I think a lot
I can only agree. I can only agree.
I can only agree.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Here.
There is a question in the chat, but I can't get my chat up for some reason. Just a
You can see
minute.
it.
Can you see it, Steve?
It's from Dave Lovell. It says, would Steve be happy to present this talk to the Royal Geographical Society North East region? Yes, I'd be delighted. You think it would be of interest? Yeah. As long as I don't have to pretend that I'm a climate scientist. My background is in agriculture and biodiversity. I work for Natural England, mainly on agri-environment schemes, persuading farmers to do things for the public interest, like biodiversity, but also reducing emissions. I didn't have enough time when I was working to really get into climate change, but I knew from long ago that that was something I really wanted to get involved in. So I'm an interested amateur, if you like, in climate change.
Me too.
I have a question.
Yes, okay, go ahead.
First of all, sorry I'm upside down, but I haven't quite sorted out that problem yet.
Australia, obviously.
But my question is relating to our consumption of meat in this country. We're very good at growing grass. And so my question is, and we like eating meat, and we do, and dairy, and we do. Now, do we all have to go vegan? And that would be difficult because, you know, there's a lot of soya grown in Brazil and all sorts of problems. But if we just ate less, because we can we're very good at feeding our animals on grass. If we stopped feeding them grain, we would be able to use our grass, which we're very good at growing.
Doesn't prevent their
what
emissions.
would your opinion be on this issue, Steve?
Well, it's Hilda, is it?
It is, yes.
Yeah, as it happens, I said I work for Natural England. I was actually a national grassland specialist, so I'm fairly familiar with grass. And yes, I personally am not a vegan. I eat meat and dairy products, although I've greatly reduced my consumption. My opinion is that it would be quite helpful if quite a lot of people went vegan. That would help. But I'm mindful that there are big issues actually with the soil in the world. As well as a climate crisis, there's also a biodiversity crisis, and there's also a soil crisis. Because of repeated cultivation, and this country is the same as many, we've had increasing specialisation of agriculture, so that in the eastern part of the country, and this is more or less the case in East Yorkshire, for example, there's very little grassland. What grassland there is on the bits that are really not much good for growing crops. And on the farms that are growing arable crops, where 50 or more years ago, there would have been a mixture of grassland in with that arable cropping. For many decades now, there hasn't been, so it's repeatedly cultivated, and that's led to the soil declining in soil organic matter, and that leads to the soil being unstable and subject to erosion, into water, and even blowing away. So there's a bit of a soil crisis. So I point out to people that livestock, ruminant livestock especially, can be an important part of sustainable food production if it's integrated with crop production. There do need to be a lot less livestock, domestic livestock in the world. At the moment, they're increasing, especially in China and East Asia, and indeed in India. So consumption of meat is dramatically increasing in most of those countries. Not India, it's not going up much. It's dairy that's increasing in India. And that is largely sustained by, as you suggested, Hilda, by feeding them grain, but also soya. And soya is being grown mainly in South America. And of course, as is widely known, it's often grown on deforested land. So the rainforest, and also other important habitats like the Cerrado, which is a sort of shrubland, vast area in Brazil and neighbouring countries, that's being ploughed up for soybeans and also for beef cattle. So that's why we have to reduce meat and dairy consumption. It's because we're on an unsustainable path. We cannot grow. We haven't got the land to grow all these crops to feed to livestock. And of course, it's very inefficient feeding things that humans could eat to livestock. So that's quite a long answer, Hilda, sorry. So I don't advocate veganism, but I do advocate a big reduction in meat and dairy. I advocate actually a greater reduction than the Climate Change Committee have suggested. They've ramped up their suggestions from a very low level. Currently at about 30%, I think, they're suggesting there should be a reduction in meat consumption. I'm not sure that they quite recognise the significance of dairy as well. So that's where I stand. Sorry, it's rather a lengthy answer.
Thank you. Yes, David was going to ask the question.
I've got my Ilkley Civic Society hat on here, but for the last couple of years, we've been trying to convince Bradford Council to be a little bit more sustainable in the town. We've had the small things individually, but all add to the picture. They've recently tarmacked a number of areas in the town, including the main car park, that's the biggest one, and expanded it in tarmac with no consideration for drainage. So because it runs off faster, we get local flooding issues. And the other issue is that there are not so good record on trees. We lost a number of 30, 40-year-old trees, and they seem quite content that they'd provided one extra tree in the car park. And I don't think that's very good. So this is Bradford Council officers, I think, that are the need convincing, and that's something all of us can help with, really.
Yeah, we in Climate Action Ilkley have made a particular point of engaging with a guy called Bob Thorpe in Bradford Council. You may know him. He's their main tree manager. And he actually seems to be very much on board with our ideas for highlighting the awareness of trees and maintaining them.
It's getting into action, though. Bob Thorpe looks after the Bradford's own trees. The other guy, Simon Keenan, looks after the private trees that go through the planning system. Yeah. And I think they're both good, but they're struggling to keep on top of issues, and particularly there was no reason at all for some of the trees to be removed from the car park.
And they went before we could say anything.
Clearly there are other positive things. we're putting a bit in our next newsletter. The positive things are the things you mentioned, that Climate Action have instigated the tree trails and the orchards. They're all great things, but I think there's an opportunity to do things locally.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, you can write to your councillors and express your opinion.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's the officers that need the digs. I think our councillors would probably be, well, they might be quite keen to have a dig at the officers as well.
Yes, probably. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's almost the hour. Is there any other urgent question anybody wishes to ask Steve?
Can I ask one?
Yes.
Hi, Steve.
Julia?
After everything that we've gone through, I really noticed that Dad's Army comment.
Yeah.
And do you not think that if we are going to hit net zero by 2050, that we do actually need something more along the lines of a World War II mobilisation from the government?
Yes. It's a huge task now because it's been delayed so long. You saw the shape of that line of what's going to happen to greenhouse gas emissions, didn't you? They've got to basically fall off a cliff. If we'd started this 20 years ago, it would have been a much more manageable process of steady decline. But I'm afraid now it's got to be dramatic. And yeah, it's a huge it's a huge prospect. What of course you can say is that there's enormous opportunities there, because if you just look at the need for our housing stock to be insulated, that's very labour intensive work. It will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, possibly millions of jobs nationally, if the government really got to grips with it, provided strong grant aid for people that are struggling to afford it and incentives for everybody else, and got to grips with the quality of the work that builders do. And we tried to set up a training scheme for local builders in how to retrofit insulation, how to insulate existing houses, including difficult houses, stone built, solid walls, no cavity. And basically, the town council were very keen to work with us on that and provide a bit of funding for a training course, but none of the builders are interested. Well, government has to tell builders, this is a legal requirement. You've got to do it. And they'd soon take an interest if their business depended on it. So it's got to get serious, really, hasn't it? And, who doesn't want to live in a nicely insulated house? It's win-win. It's comfortable and you save money on your heating. You just got to do it. But it's a huge task. Yeah. So, yes, you're right. A wartime spirit is what's needed. Yes.
Thank you for that. I think on that note, somebody's just left and said thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
I saw that, yeah.
And I think it's been another excellent presentation, and really we've got to get our fingers out, haven't we? And do something to make any difference. Lobbying does work eventually, but it's taking too long this time. We've got to rally the troops.
Can I have a word, please?
Who's that?
Brian.
Brian, yeah, you can.
Thank you. Could I say one or two things? I think one of the things that you left out, and that I don't know quite how we're going to do it, and is probably one of the basic faults, if you like, the way we live, is that there are too many people. The world is growing exponentially in numbers. And somehow or other, we've got to cut back on the number of people who are producing and taking make of the CO2 which we produce into the sky. The other thing I wanted to ask is, when you talk of the emission, do you include everything, or are you just including CO2? The other thing I'd like to say is that we actually have plenty of energy here. There's enough energy from the sun to keep us all going, and that's no problem there. We do also now have machines that can extract CO2 from the air as a machine and combine it chemically to produce fuel. These things need working on. And also, I think perhaps this is a little bit out of order, but the models on which we make our future demands really made to look at against what is actually happening. Over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I didn't actually miss out the too many people bit, but maybe you missed it. What I
was
said,
a bit late, I agree, yes.
Oh, right. Well, what I said was, yes, there are too many people. The current population, though, in many of the wealthier countries is stable or even declining. The big population increases are taking place in Africa, but those countries, the people in those countries, have minuscule carbon footprints. They are 1/20th or less of our carbon footprint. So although they're increasing in numbers, they're not having that much impact on greenhouse gas emissions.
But that's not true for China and India.
Well, China's not increasing in population, Brian.
Yes, it is. It
well,
is.
Hardly. It's not going to increase very much. Yeah, it might be a bit of a residual bit, but basically it's predicted to go down now.
Yeah.
Because Chinese women, although they're now allowed to have 3 children, they don't want them anymore. On the greenhouse gases, yes, most of what I was talking about, the data I was showing, was including all greenhouse gases. So that includes the main ones, other than carbon dioxide, are methane,
right,
and nitrous oxide.
Yeah.
The CO2 extraction, if you like, engineering fixes, there is some of that factored in to countries' net zero calculation, which actually I think there's a fairly optimistic slant being put on that by many countries, because at the moment those technologies are very expensive, very energetically expensive, and it's very uncertain whether they will actually be a realistic prospect. But yeah, you know, that it is possible to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and store it somewhere, possibly in an empty oil or gas well somewhere. And models of demand, I'm not quite sure about that one, Brian. I think I'll pass on answering that. I don't know much about models of demand, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
If you want to contact me afterwards, Brian, I'm happy to pursue this.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And I think it's time we wrapped it up now and just gave him our usual round of applause, if you'd like to unmute, and show our appreciation of the excellent presentation and the time he's taken to give it to us. And I'm sure he'd be there to answer any further questions privately later if you wish to contact Climate Action. Okay, thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening.